Okay, when we're talking about the East Asian region, I will go ahead and continue to say this probably again and again and again this lecture. We really are going to focus mostly on China. It is the powerhouse sovereign state of the region, but more importantly, it is a powerhouse sovereign state world power now, again, here in the 21st century. Depending on the numbers or the statisticians or the economists you read about or talk to, they will say already that China is the world's largest economy. If not, it's the second largest, soon to become the largest in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. China is playing an increasingly important role and a big role in world problems, in military conflicts, in global policy like global warming and other things. China has really stepped back into its natural role as a titan of world power on the first order, and that has not been the case for virtually all of your lifetime, virtually all of my lifetime, virtually for all my grandparents' lifetime, for virtually all of the history of the United States. China has not been in that role, but they're back now, and so I want to explain the East Asian region mostly through a Chinese lens, and then we'll work in the stories of those other peripheral geographic entities that I mentioned as the story unfolds. So East Asia, powerhouse China is the focus for most of this lecture. I'm going to break it into, you know me, I try to tell a story, I try to keep it brief, I rarely succeed at that, but let me highlight some things I think you need to know to understand China in the modern context. Some is physical geography, some is historic, some is cultural, some's a little bit of everything else. So I'm going to try to limit myself to just seven special big things you need to know to understand China in today's world. First thing number one, if you like, there are big differences between East and West just within China. Again, we're talking about the sovereign state of China for now. Big differences between East and West, and I'm talking mostly physical for starters. Now, to start off physically, I want to put it into context for you that China is almost exactly the same size as the United States. In fact, depending on what atlas you were to look at, some would list the United States as the third largest country on planet Earth and China as the fourth largest. Some would reverse that and say that China is the third largest and the United States is the fourth largest. They're that close in square miles, square kilometers, or whatever measure you want to use. Here is an image of China superimposed onto the continental 48 United States. And you'll see that it overlaps quite nicely. Of course, Alaska's not in here, but Alaska's pretty huge in its own right. You can see that these are two entities, geographically, physically, that are almost identical. So, most of you are probably from the United States. If not, most of you know about the United States. If you know anything about the dimensions of the United States, now you know about how big China is. These are big countries, and of course, there are big deals on planet Earth too, and it's amazing. I'm starting here at the start, pointing out that it is amazing how many similarities there are between the United States and China, but everybody keeps forgetting about them because they're like, no, the Americans are over here, and those European descent folks, and then the Chinese people are over here in China, and they're two wildly different states. Well, yeah, kind of, but physically they're very similar, and let me continue on this similarities path thinking physically about China. As I pointed out, there's a big difference between Eastern and Western China, so much so I'm going to divide the state kind of in half for this lecture, and it starts with the physical. U.S. and China, about the same size, full on, but there are big differences when you start to look at what's the difference between Eastern and Western United States versus Eastern and Western China. When it comes to Eastern China, you can see here from this elevation shaded map that they have lowlands depicted here in the green, and that as you progress inward, you get the yellows, which means you're going up in elevation a little bit, and the yellow spaces down in the south are small hilly mountains, kind of like, say, the low parts of the Appalachian Mountains or the Blue Ridge. And as you progress further inland into China, the mountains start to get a little bit higher. They start to turn into yellows and browns, signifying maybe 3,000, 4,000, maybe 5,000 feet elevation. But bam, when you start to get deep west in China, you see that big brown football. That's the Tibetan Plateau. And now you're getting significant high elevation, significant terrain differences. where the average height of the Tibetan Plateau, and that's just the average height, the plateau itself, where you start, the average elevation is about 12,000 feet above sea level. Wow, that's high, all right? That's like Rocky Mountain high. But on top of the average Tibetan Plateau of 12,000 feet above sea level is some of the highest mountains on planet Earth. The ones you've heard of, like K2, Mount Everest. The Himalayan range defines the territory or defines the borders between say, China and India and Nepal. So mountains that exceed 27,000, 28, 29,000 feet above sea level. That's the Himalayan range. But again, those are the high ones. Those are the peaks you've heard of. You're like, whoa, that's super high. Do keep in context this whole brown shaded area, the Tibetan Plateau, on average, 12,000 feet above sea level. That's super high. That's super tough. When you get up that high, there's thinner air, we call it. There's less oxygen molecules in the air, so people, us down here at sea level, would have a hard time even breathing up in anywhere in the Tibetan Plateau before you even start going up the super high mountains. So in the west, big Tibetan Plateau in southwestern China, and you see even that there's a big yellow football north of the brown Tibetan Plateau football there. That's the Taklamakan Basin. It's actually kind of low. It's only like 1,000 or 2,000 feet above sea level, but it's a vast area of desert. It's a lowland depression desert, and you see that there's mountains rimming the northern and western fringe of that Taklamakan Basin as well. So when we get into China, the east coast of China is very similar to the east coast of the United States. Lowland coastal plains, and again, all the areas you see shaded in green over here on eastern China are low coastal plains. A lot of agriculture, huge amounts of agricultural production actually. A well-watered area, you see rivers flowing through it, people can move around in it, lots of canals between the rivers. You have an area very, very similar to the United States of America, the eastern half, but that's where the similarities cease, because as we progress west, much like the United States, it gets more arid when you get to the interior. We have the Great Plains of the United States, the prairie region, then you hit the Rocky Mountains where you're getting 10, 12, 15,000 feet peaks. So that's kind of tough. That's kind of a barrier. But in the United States, once you cross from east to west, once you cross the Rocky Mountains, then you go over to the West Coast. And you know the American West Coast, the Pacific Ocean's over there. There's different types of climates. There's big populations over there. That's the United States. In China, once you go up in elevation, as you progress to the interior, as you go further and further west, you get fewer and fewer people, because what you run into is more and more elevation, more and more tough elevation, and more arid areas. And in fact, as a general rule of thumb, as you progress into China from the eastern coast, you will get higher, it will get drier, and there'll be more extremes of temperatures. So it can get super freezing cold in the wintertime and actually super freaking hot in the summertime. Big areas of elevation, a raised elevation, Tibetan Plateau, big areas of full-on desert. You have the Gobi Desert over there. The Taklamakan Basin is basically a huge desert. So pretty extreme all the way around as you progress into China. Here's a nice cross-section I've used for years, showing you the elevation from a side angle, looking at the lowland areas, small hills, again, similar to the Appalachians, in eastern China, but then as you progress up and get further and further in, you're getting into mountainous areas that are way tougher than even the Rocky Mountain interior of the United States of America. Does that make sense? Cool. So higher, drier, more extreme as you go from eastern China to western China. Now, let's get back to another similarity. I said these two countries, the U.S. and China, are very similar in size. They're actually very similar in latitude as well. So what does that mean? That map that I showed you, it shows you China superimposed on the United States. And here's another trick. Latitude is being held constant. Meaning, if you know anything about, say, Maine versus Florida, in terms of the climate and vegetation that Maine has and how that's different from Florida and how it's different from Virginia, almost exactly in between Maine and Florida, you know roughly the latitude range in China as well from north to south. So way up north in Manchuria, which is the northeastern quadrant of China, it goes way further north than, say, even Maine does. It'd be all the way over the U.S.-Canadian border into deep Canada. And you know that, well, it's colder up there in upstate New York and Maine and Vermont. And they get snow, and it's cold in the wintertime, but they're 4 seasons. So they also have spring, the summer, winter, fall. And That's exactly the same as in eastern China. So Manchuria, it's kind of like upstate New York or eastern Canada. The opposite of that is that Henan province or Henan Island, that little island is all the way down south in China. That's further south than even Florida or Texas. It's be down in the Caribbean, again, superimposed here in our hemisphere. So it's full-on tropical down there. Fully full-on tropical, say like the climate and vegetation of Cuba or the Bahamas. And then everything else on eastern China falls somewhere in between, the same way it does in the United States. So, you know, the climate and vegetation, say, of Maine, of Virginia, of Florida, now you know the exact breakdown of, say, Manchuria down to Guangzhou and deep south to Henan Island at the furthest southernmost point in China. It's kind of the same. 4 seasons climates that are different according to how far north or how far south you are. Got it? Is that cool? Yeah? You would be very comfortable traveling around lots of parts of China if you traveled around eastern United States and eastern Canada. You'll see pine forest and deciduous forest and well-watered areas, just like there's well-watered from the Mississippi all the way over to, say, the New River, and all of the terrain, all of the vegetation, all of it. The forest, all of it's very, very similar in eastern China to eastern United States. However, to finish off this little spin here, back up 5 minutes to what I was saying, but as you progress further into the interior of China, higher, drier, more extreme. So as you can see from this vegetation zone map, once you cross over from east to west in China, it becomes quite distinct that it's going to dry out and become more like, say, chaparral or steppe, and then to full-on desert regime where you don't have a lot of vegetation at all. You're going to run out of trees and run into sand. And of course, if you go up the Tibetan Plateau, you're going to run into basically almost tundra-type climates, what we call kind of upper mountain climates, way cooler all year round, some seasonality, but not quite as much. Does that make sense? So big differences. Remember the whole topic I started ranting on here is big difference between eastern and western China. I'm just planting the seed for you to understand that, oh, and eastern China is very much like eastern United States. And all of the vegetation and latitude and seasonality that goes with that. Different over in the West, though. Here's another thing that's different between eastern and western China. Now we're going to focus on China itself for the rest of this rant. The river system flows the opposite way as it does, say, in the United States, even eastern United States. So the big system of the United States is the Mississippi. Flows from north to south, right? There are rivers that flow from the Appalachian Mountains eastward into the Atlantic Ocean, for sure. But the major river system of the North American continent, the Mississippi, north to south. In China, it's the reverse. The major systems are west to east. And the big rivers you should know for sure are the Yellow. The Yellow, a big, huge, important one for all of Chinese civilization for the last 5,000 years. The Yangtze, just as important, huge major river system. And the Xi, the Xi River, Xi River down south. All of these rivers pull from the interior in the west and transport things eastward to the coast. Now, why is that? What? Is Boyer really making us learn rivers and what direction they flow? Yes! It helps you understand the evolution of this society historically and its focus even in the modern world right this second today. The rivers are just a physical entity. They're water moving. But what they move from the interior to the coast are, just physically speaking, sediment, dust, dirt. These rivers, which have been the source for drinking water for the Chinese population for 5,000 to 10,000 years, also bring replenishing dirt, which when the rivers flow, they deposit all that dirt and make for very fertile agricultural land. So they have helped over the centuries and millennia focus where people grow food and focus how much food they can grow and how many people can hang out there because there's lots of water and lots of food. And the answer to that is lots of both. In the East, where lots of Chinese people have been hanging out for lots of time. The river system is a major part of this. Also focuses economic activity from the interior to the coast. So everything in China is focused towards the coast, pushing things physically, pushing culture, pushing urban settlement to the coastal regions. The rivers are a major part of that and have been, again, for a very long time. How can I prove that in today's world? Is this all speculative? No. people settle where there's water, where there's food, and where there's an overall conducive climate. People don't like when it's freezing cold all the time. People don't like it when it's stinking hot all the time. I've now pointed out, because of the river system and the direction of the flow, lots of food, lots of water, and it's a mid-latitude climate, much like the Eastern United States. And thus, we can see the population distribution in China in today's world as a product of many centuries gone by that have intentionally focused folks to hang out in these particular parts of planet Earth. Maybe you've seen this map before in other places or even in this class. The PEEPS patterns are quite distinct in East Asia, China in particular, and that is that this map shows you a population dot density map where each dot represents 100,000 people. 100,000 Chinese people for the most part, unless you're looking at the 100,000 per dot Korean people over there, or 100,000 per dot Japanese people in Japan. But just look at the pattern as you zoom into this East Asian region that we're talking about here. Are you seeing the rivers, by the way, that are, kind of look like those big phallic symbol-looking things pointing inwards? High population clusters along the major river systems. That's been there forever. And as the Chinese and Korean populations have grown over the centuries and centuries and centuries, this energy focus, this river focus, this agricultural focus, this urban focus has all pushed to the coast, so much so that of the 1.5 billion people in this region, virtually all of them are within several hundred miles of the coast and definitely within several hundred miles of the major river systems. And boom, you can see it right there. And that starts to get back to, oh, why was Professor Boyer talking about dividing China in half? He's been talking about China as a whole. Because it starts with the physical. It's very different east to west in China. Very different. And you can see it here in just the population dot density map. And now I've listed all of the physical reasons why that is. So there's a very distinct east versus west difference in climate, in vegetation, and that leads to a very distinct difference between where people are. That is an urban-rural divide in China. And you can literally just draw a line. And it almost follows biomes or climate regimes perfectly, where on one side of that line, it's conducive climates, conducive vegetation regimes, conducive biomes, and there's water and all this other stuff there in the east. And when you cross that line over the west, it's mostly highlands and deserts, and it's dry and hardly anybody's home. So really, when you start to go to Western China, it's a different world, not just physically, but because people ain't hanging out there, because they're not conducive climates for 1 billion people to hang out there. Most of the 1 billion are over there on the east side. So, and most of them are in cities, by the way. So a very distinct east-west divide. It becomes a rural-urban divide. And I know you've seen this pic before, probably in the textbook, Lights at Night image that was compiled that just shows you basically where the economic action is, where the development is, where infrastructure is, by do they have lights at night or not. And China and the Koreas, by the way, perhaps are the greatest distinctions between the developed and non-developed parts of planet Earth, and certainly the developed versus non-developed parts of East Asia. You can see literally from just lights at night image that Western China is virtually unpopulated. That Tibetan Plateau, there ain't nobody home. There's barely anybody holding a candle over there. Much of northwestern China, the Xinjiang region, it's mostly uninhabited as well. There's just not a lot of infrastructure. Now, there's a lot of people, I suppose, in some of the major urban areas, but those are the bright dots that you see between these big voids of the Tibetan Plateau and northeastern or northwestern China, where it's mostly lights out. In the Inner Mongolia, in the Mongolian, in the Gobi Desert, in the Tibetan Plateau, there's nobody there. And then the other thing, again, everybody's focused in the east, surprise, surprise. But then the other hilarious thing to point out on this map is, well, you see Japan, fully developed Japan, lit up like a Christmas tree. Look at Taiwan. Hey, it's lit up as well. Yeah, Taiwan, very developed, very rich place. Levels of infrastructure and development, the same as the United States or any Western European country. That's perhaps not unexpected, but it helps define some of the differences between Taiwan and the rest of the mainland. But the other thing I wanted to point out that's hilarious, of course, is the Koreas. You have to look closely on this map. Otherwise, you'll think that what we're looking at South Korea is an island, because South Korea is all lit up, just like Japan, just like Taiwan, all lit up. You can see the coastline. And then north of it is a big black void. And so if you were just you kind of just glancing at this map, you'd think that South Korea is just another island like Japan is that's not connected to the mainland. And it is. It's just that North Korea is so backwards ass clueless with virtually no infrastructure throughout much of the country that they got nothing. They don't have electricity being piped to most of their 20 or 30 million inhabitants. So it shows up as a nice dark void in this particular map. The only thing you can see is Pyongyang there, that brightest light, which is the presidential palace probably, and then a handful of people holding candles out there. I mean, that's it. So you can really start to see some unique differences within the region. We're just talking about East Asia still, between Eastern Western China, Northern and Southern Korea, and even Taiwan, that oddball out there, which is kind of more developed like, say, South Korea and Japan, right? Got it? Okay. And just to superimpose one last time the population dot density map, you can see, look at that. Oh, I just love going back and forth. Oh, yeah, there's the lights, and then there's the peeps on top of it, defining where most of the humans are in this South Asian region. However, let me bring it back. To the point, the point I'm trying to make here of there's big difference between Eastern and Western China. Physically, you got it. And population density, you got that now too. There's differences between East and West. The last thing I want you to know is, in China, all the people ain't Chinesey. Meaning, there's actually ethnic differences between Eastern and Western China as well. Some really important big ones. Most of us from outside of China see China as very monolithic. Oh, it's this big country and it's got 1 billion Chinese people in it. Yeah, mostly kind of. But there are some differences worthy of note. Namely, this ethnic group map is showing you that what you consider Chinese people are ethnically better labeled as Han Chinese people. And Han is simply a name that, to me, just kind of encapsulate, yes, whatever you think in your head is Chinese or Chinese people, it's Han. The ethnicity, the tribe, is Han Chinese. And this is named after the Han Dynasty, one of their classic greatest dynasties or imperial lines from back in the day that roughly, and I'm not going to go big into dynastic action here in this lecture, but the Han Dynasty was around roughly the same time as the Roman Empire in Western Europe. So about, 1 or 200 BC to 1 or 200 AD, the Han Dynasty was a contemporary of the Roman Empire over there in the West, with just as much flourishes and importance and everything else. It's kind of looked upon as a golden age of Chinese civilization. Therefore, much like the Roman Empire is kind of the basis of Western civilization, let's say, the Han Empire was so important that the Chinese people over time have just named themselves the Han Chinese people. So when you think of Chinese people, it's Han Chinese people. But not all of the East Asian region is Chinese people, not even Han Chinese people. Namely, you already know, Korea, North and South Korea, those are Korean people. And here's an inside tip. There's not any ethnic difference between North Korean people and South Korean people. It's just Korean people. Again, back to the question of why is there 2 Koreas when there's only 1 Korean people? We'll talk about that later. Inside China itself, though, we see that there are folks that are distinctly not Chinese. They would not identify themselves as Chinese. In fact, they would take personal offense if you thought they were all Chinese. And that is the Tibetan Plateau is Tibetan people. Yeah, that makes sense. You probably have heard of that before. You might have even heard of Free Tibet. We'll talk about that later, too. When you get to Mongolia, a country that was part of China for some point in history, several hundred years, maybe 500 or 600, before it was teased off into a sovereign state. Mongolian people are in Mongolia, and there's a state, a sub-state of China called Inner Mongolia. It's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, actually. And it is comprised mostly of ethnically Mongolian people. Surprise, surprise. Remember, ethnicities are like tribes, and throughout most of the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, they didn't just hang out in one place. They've been all over the place. And since then, we've drawn lines, namely in the last 50 years, sovereign state lines, that have split people. So a lot of Mongolians are in China now because they're in this Inner Mongolia part of China. But they're not alone. If you see that bright yellow area up in the deep northwest, that's Kazakh, a lot of ethnically Kazakh people. And you see they share a border with Kazakhstan next door. Again, no surprises there. And the last one I really want to point out that's of some great significance in today's world is the Uyghurs. And that's a tough one to say and spell because they don't look alike. It's U-Y-G-H-U-R, Uyghur, spelled or pronounced like with a W. The Uyghur folks are also I think still the majority ethnic group in Xinjiang province. That's a really huge province up in northwestern China. And they're, I guess I shouldn't go into great detail right this second, but let me kind of sum up a few things for you. These are all non-Chinese ethnic people who are in today's China, a sovereign state. There are also other small patches you see of some other distinct folks down in southeastern China, but I just want to point out the main ones: Mongolian, Tibetan, Uyghur. And there are some issues within China, within a single sovereign state called China, with these non-Chinese people, some of which, again, you've heard quite a lot about, probably in your lifetimes, and that is the Tibetans. On again, off again, have perhaps wanted to have a free and independent Tibet, and they say, hey, look, we're ethnically not Chinese, and we would like to have our own state. And maybe this guy named the Dalai Lama has helped promote that. I don't think he has. The Chinese government thinks that he definitely is trying to make a separate Tibetan state. But they're not alone. And so you might have heard of, there have been wars fought over Tibet. There have been uprisings in Tibet. There are a lot of Buddhist monks who catch themselves on fire in protest in Tibet that they want to do their own separate state or want more rights or want whatever. But they're not alone. There have been riots and uprisings even in Inner Mongolia. Anytime a Chinese trucker or a Chinese military vehicle gets in an accident in Inner Mongolia and runs over a child or kills somebody in a car wreck, that sparks big protest in Inner Mongolia. Or Mongolians would say, hey, look, we're in China, but we don't get treated the same. We don't have rights. And again, this is what a lot of Tibetans would say about their area called Tibet. And even in this place called Xinjiang, which I keep pointing out, where there's a lot of Uyghur ethnic folks. The Uyghurs are unique in that they are not just ethnically not Chinese, but they are religiously Islamic. So there have been perhaps some movements towards greater autonomy or even an independent Uyghur state, which of course is going to tear some area away from China, and China's not going to have any of that. They're not going to let Tibet be free. They're not letting Inner Mongolia get reabsorbed into Mongolia. The Chinese government's not doing any of these things. So when there's any sort of violence, protest, uprising in any of these places, and the Xinjiang province is the one that's gotten the most action here as of late, the Chinese military steps in, puts down any protest or uprising. There's usually a news blackout. You won't hear anything out of it. Just suddenly there's something happening in Xinjiang, and it's a news blackout until things are settled. So the point I'm making here is there are a lot of folks in China that aren't necessarily Chinese. Having said that, Han Chinese is the overwhelming majority of people in China. And I don't know the exact number, but it's easy 90 or 95%. It's a solid 90%, maybe closer to 95% in China. Of the 1.5 billion people in China are Han Chinese. But there are these other minorities that are of some significance even in today's world because perhaps they don't get along with the Chinese government or want to form their own sovereign states. Got it? Okay. One last word on ethnically Chinese things, and that is a word on Chinese language. Chinese language is also, much like Chinese people, usually put into a big monolithic category. And you're like, oh, all Chinese people speak Chinese. Yeah, kind of. Mostly, yeah. So if you learn Chinese, the language, yes, you can go and you'll get around in most parts of China just fine, and there'll be people that only speak Chinese language in the vast majority of Eastern China, and even in places that don't necessarily speak Chinese, there'll be enough people that still speak the Chinese language. And what I mean by that is Mandarin is the name of the majority language. Mandarin Chinese. Again, they're so ubiquitous, they're so kind of the same thing in most of our heads that just like we say Chinese people, it's Han Chinese people, or they're Chinese people, and Chinese language is actually Mandarin. We just call it Chinese Mandarin. But there are other languages, and maybe 70 or 75% of Chinese people speak Mandarin. Again, it's the overwhelming majority language, but there are others. And I've talked to Chinese people, especially from Chinese people from the southern parts of China. The southeast is where you have a lot of language diversity. And it's a common basis of the language, but again, it's kind of like regional dialects, but over thousands of years, or at least centuries, they've become unique enough that some people, even within China, don't understand other people in China. So it's not exactly like saying, well, everyone in America speaks English, but there's a southern dialect of English versus an upstate New York dialect of English. There's that, but there actually is significant enough language differences, linguistic differences, that not all people, even within China, will understand everybody in the South. Does that make sense? Okay. I've heard this is true in Germany too, by the way. I talk to Germans about how they think about Bavaria. They make fun of that place all the time, and they'll say, they're supposedly speaking German down there, but I can't understand what the hell they're saying in Munich. I've heard that from so many Germans, and they think they're hicks down there. So I don't know how it breaks down in China, if people think less or more highly of their language versus others. But regional variation does occur. Ethnic variation occurs within China. Linguistic variation occurs within China. And food differences occur within China. And that's the other thing I love to point out, that yes, all you Americans, oh my gosh, you poor Americans who think you've been eating Chinese food all these years, you don't have any idea of what's going on with Chinese food, because saying the term Chinese food, again, it's very monolithic and it mostly means nothing. Chinese food is like saying American food, or better yet, European food. What does European food mean? I mean, there's Italian, and there's British, and there's German food, and there's French food, and there's Slovenian food. Yes, the term European food makes utter nonsensical no sense in your brain. And that's the way you should actually think about the words Chinese food as well. It's been made into a very generic standard fare in American Chinese restaurants, but they do not represent the great diversity of food and culture across China. Meaning, China's big, again, much like America, and it's bigger than Europe. So is America, all right? But when you have an area this big, in different climates and different vegetation, biomes, people have grown different foods in different parts of China over time and developed regional cuisines based upon these different foods in different parts of China. So there are radical differences between northern Chinese food and southern Chinese food in terms of using corn over wheat, or basing your noodles. See, noodles are a Chinese invention. And they make them out of a corn base in the north and a grain base in the south. I think that's right. So noodles are very different, but even the spice profiles they use. So maybe you've been to Chinese restaurants, that means nothing, but maybe you've been to Mongolian restaurants, say from like Inner Mongolia. Yeah, that's, okay, now that's different food. Or Manchurian restaurants, or Hunan. If you heard, you know the difference between a Hunan or Cantonese cuisine. These are all radically different cuisines from different parts of the country. And I can tell you just off the top of my head, Cantonese food's hot. The further south you go in China, those are where the spices are from. So you have regional variation just in spice. And northern Chinese food, it's like, yeah, it's good. I like it all, depending on where it's from. But the spicy stuff's down south. Cantonese and Hunan, woo, you get some hot stuff. And of course, regional variations in cuisine mean that different parts of the country have developed or invented different foods that we, again, foreigners, just lump all into one category of Chinese food, and we really shouldn't. Things like pickled cabbages or kimchi from Korea. They do pickled stuff a lot up in northern China, in Manchuria. But steamed bread, again, like I was saying, different types of noodles from different places. Meatballs, Hunan spice is super hot. Sweet and sour pork is from Canton. Sticky rice is from down south. Sichuan spice uses a lot of different hot pepper. Woo! They're way different than other places. But you can pick all your favorite Chinese food from lots of different places and see that, wow, saying China, treating China as a monolithic entity for food is ridiculous, right? You get that now? That's also what I want you to apply to your brain when you think of treating Chinese people as monolithic, treating the Chinese ethnicities as monolithic, treating Chinese language as monolithic, treating the country of China itself as monolithic. It makes virtually no sense because the place is so big and has such great variation from north to south and east to west. And to sum up and bring it back what I was saying with thing one you need to know about China, these variations in climate, in vegetation, in cuisine, in people, in urban-rural divide all of these things taken together are why that I tease out Eastern China versus Western China. That's thing one to know. East versus West is really big difference, and we're going to focus mostly on Eastern China when we're defining the rest of our East Asian region, because that's the place where most of the people have been for most of Chinese history. Got it? Good. Let's get on with thing two.